The morning sun stretched over the small town of Crestfield, painting its quiet streets in gold and amber. On Main Street, the heart of the town's daily life, the familiar clinking of dishes and the low hum of conversations filled Mary's Diner, a modest place where truckers, families, and workers stopped for coffee and a hot meal. It was the kind of place where faces were recognized, where reputations lingered long after people left. On this particular morning, the door creaked open, and a tall man in his mid-40s stepped inside. His presence was commanding without effort. His broad shoulders and upright stance told a story even before his lips could. His name was Marcus Hill, a decorated Army veteran who had given over 2 decades of his life in service to his country. But unlike most who saw him in uniform, here he wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a clean button-up shirt, and boots polished from habit, not necessity. Marcus's skin carried the deep brown tone of his heritage, and his face bore lines of discipline and sacrifice. Yet in his eyes there was a gentleness, a quiet strength, that revealed not just a soldier, but a man who had endured much and overcome even more. He wasn't in town to boast of medals or recount tales of combat. He had been stationed at Crestfield's military base for just under a year, recently promoted to a role that few knew was his. He was the commanding officer, the man responsible for the lives of hundreds of service members and, by extension, the safety of the very town whose streets now watched him enter that diner. But today, Marcus was simply a man looking for breakfast. He chose a seat near the window, where light streamed in and gave him a view of the bustling street outside. He ordered a coffee and eggs, offering the waitress a polite smile. She recognized him faintly, but did not know his full story. For Marcus, that anonymity was a blessing. He did not crave recognition. Across the diner, however, another man's eyes had locked onto him the moment he entered. Officer Blake Turner, a local cop notorious for his short temper and deep-seated prejudices, sat at the counter nursing his own coffee. Turner was a man who wore his badge like armor, not to protect, but to dominate. He believed Crestfield belonged to men like him, white, loud, and unquestioned. The sight of Marcus, calm and dignified, sitting so comfortably in a place Turner thought was reserved for his kind, stirred something ugly in him. Turner muttered under his breath, drawing glances from a few patrons, but he didn't care. He slid off his stool, boots echoing across the tiled floor, and made his way to Marcus's table. The diner quieted, the air tightening as if everyone knew trouble had just been invited in. "Hey," Turner's voice was sharp, dripping with authority he hadn't been asked to wield. "This seat taken?" Marcus looked up, calm and collected. "Doesn't appear so, but I'd prefer to eat alone." Turner smirked. "Funny thing, folks like you don't usually sit here. Place like this. It's for locals, not outsiders." The words were sharp, and though veiled, they carried the venom of something more. Marcus sipped his coffee, steady hands betraying no agitation. "I wasn't aware this diner had rules written in skin color," he replied evenly. The murmur in the diner grew faint, whispers fluttering among the patrons. Turner's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Watch your tone, boy. Don't forget who keeps order in this town." Marcus placed his cup down, meeting Turner's eyes. "Respect is earned, officer, not demanded." That subtle defiance ignited the fire in Turner. His hand slammed against the table, rattling the silverware. "Get up," he ordered. "You don't belong here. Out, now," the waitress stammered, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. She wanted to intervene but feared the consequences. The room was frozen, every set of eyes fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. Marcus remained seated, his calmness contrasting violently with Turner's hostility. He had been in war zones, stared down enemies far more dangerous than this man. But here, in his own country, in a small-town diner, he was again being told he didn't belong because of the color of his skin. "Officer," Marcus said slowly, his voice steady but firm, "I've served this country longer than you've worn that badge. I have bled for it, buried friends for it, and I will not be disrespected in the very land I swore to protect." Turner's face flushed with anger. He reached for Marcus's arm, intent on dragging him out by force. But Marcus pulled back, rising on his own terms. His height towered over the officer, his presence commanding even without the weight of his uniform. "I'm leaving because I choose to," Marcus said, "not because you ordered it." The diner was silent as Marcus walked out, the door closing behind him. For a moment, no one moved. Turner stood rigid, chest heaving, but the unease among the patrons was palpable. Some shook their heads, others whispered about the shame of what had just happened. But no one spoke up, not yet. Fear lingered too thick in the air. Outside, Marcus inhaled deeply, centering himself. It wasn't the first time he had faced such disrespect, but the sting was sharper here. Crestfield was his responsibility. Its people, every single one of them, were under his protection, though most had no idea that the man they had just watched humiliated was the same man commanding the base at the edge of town. He walked back toward his vehicle, a government-issued SUV parked quietly by the curb. Sliding into the driver's seat, Marcus stared at his reflection in the rear-view mirror. His jaw was tight, his eyes stormy. "Not for me," he whispered, almost as a prayer. "But for every soldier who can't speak back." Back inside the diner, Turner swaggered back to his seat, muttering about putting people in their place. But not everyone shared his smugness. A young man in the corner, barely 20, sat stiffly, his fists clenched under the table. His older brother had just enlisted, and he had recognized Marcus immediately. He knew that wasn't just some stranger Turner had humiliated. That was Colonel Marcus Hill, the commanding officer of the base. And word, as it always does in small towns, would soon travel fast. The news of what had happened at Mary's diner spread through Crestfield like wildfire. Small towns were like that. Stories grew wings, carried by whispers, repeated over cups of coffee, behind counters, and across front porches. By noon, most people had heard some version of it. A black man had been kicked out of the diner by Officer Blake Turner. Some said it was just a misunderstanding. Others said Turner had gone too far. A few, mostly those who admired Turner's swagger, said the officer had, quote, done the right thing. But the details blurred, and no one spoke of the truth with certainty, except for the young man who had recognized Marcus. His name was Darren Jacobs, and he couldn't let it go. Darren's brother Elijah had just shipped out for basic training, and Marcus had shaken Elijah's hand only weeks earlier at a community event near the base. Darren knew exactly who Marcus was. He wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't just some passerby. He was Colonel Marcus Hill, the commanding officer of Fort Crestfield, the sprawling military base that was the town's economic backbone, and, in many ways, its shield. Darren tried to tell people, but few listened. Some dismissed him, others scoffed. "If he's really that important," one older man sneered, "why would he let himself get treated like that?" Darren didn't have the words to answer. He only knew what he had seen. Marcus leaving with dignity, refusing to be dragged into Turner's hatred. By the evening, Turner was already telling his version of the story at the local bar. He painted himself as the hero who had handled an arrogant outsider who thought he could talk back to law enforcement. His words were laced with casual racism laughed at by men who'd known him for years. But beneath the laughter, there was unease. The diner had been full, after all, and not everyone there saw Turner's actions as something to cheer about. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in his office at the base. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, maps pinned across the walls, reports waiting for review. But his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the faces in the diner, of the silence that had filled the room when Turner had humiliated him. He thought of the young waitress whose eyes had pleaded for peace but whose voice had stayed quiet. And he thought of the weight of his uniform, now folded neatly in his quarters, a uniform that commanded respect in nearly every corner of the world, except, it seemed, in the very town he had sworn to protect. Marcus had spent years leading men and women into danger, training them to stand tall in the face of adversity. He had taught them that dignity was not given by others, but carried within. Yet when hatred reached into his own life, he was reminded that the fight was never just on distant battlefields. It was here, too, in the places where people ate, worked, and lived. The following morning, the ripple effect began. The base had caught wind of what happened. Soldiers whispered among themselves, their loyalty to Marcus unshaken, but their anger rising. Some wanted to confront Turner, to make him understand who he had insulted. Marcus, however, forbade it. He issued a quiet but firm order. No one was to retaliate. "We lead by example," he reminded them. "We do not stoop to ignorance." But the town of Crestfield was beginning to piece the truth together, with or without Marcus's involvement. Local reporter caught wind of the story from Darren Jacobs and began digging. Within a day, an article appeared online. Local officer confronts black veteran at diner. Veteran turns out to be base commander. The headline was enough to light the fuse. Phones rang in town hall. The mayor, once content to let Turner's behavior slide, now found himself cornered by angry calls and questions. Crestfield relied on the base for jobs, contracts, and protection. To insult its commander was to risk not just reputation but livelihood. The town could not afford that. Turner, however, was not humbled. When confronted by his superiors, he defended himself with venom. "I don't care if he runs the base or the White House. He disrespected me. I was doing my job." His words revealed not just arrogance but a blindness to the storm he had stirred. That evening, Marcus was invited to a town hall meeting. At first, he considered declining. He had no desire to stand before the same people who had watched him be humiliated and said nothing. But then he thought of the soldiers under his command, of the young black men and women who looked to him for an example of strength. He knew he had to go, not for his pride, but for the principle. The meeting was packed. Folding chairs filled the hall, townsfolk buzzing with anticipation. Some were curious, others defensive, and a few already ashamed. At the front sat the mayor, stiff and uneasy, with Turner slouched in the corner, arms crossed, jaw tight. As Marcus entered, the room fell silent. He was in uniform this time, the weight of his rank clear on his shoulders. His presence changed the air, demanding attention not with force but with dignity. He took the podium, pausing as his eyes swept across the crowd. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," Marcus began, his voice deep and steady. "I came here to tell the truth." He recounted the events of the diner without embellishment, his words calm but piercing. He spoke not of anger but of disappointment. Disappointment that a man sworn to uphold the law had instead chosen to abuse it, and disappointment that others had watched in silence. "I have served this nation for over 20 years, Marcus said. "I have stood in deserts halfway across the world, in jungles, in cities torn by war. And everywhere I've been, I have carried the belief that I was protecting a country worth fighting for, a country where dignity and justice were not just words but promises. Yesterday, in that diner, I was reminded that those promises are still being broken, even here in our own backyard." The room was hushed. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their heads. Turner's face hardened, but even he could not dismiss the gravity of Marcus's words. "I am not asking for special treatment," Marcus continued. "I am asking for decency, not for me, but for every person in this town who has been made to feel less because of the color of their skin, or the way they speak, or the life they live. If Crestfield is to be a community worth protecting, then it must be a community that protects all of its people." His words hung in the air, heavy but liberating. Applause began slowly. One clap, then another, then a wave until the hall thundered with it. The sound was not just approval but release, a collective recognition of truth that had been too long ignored. Turner sat rigid, refusing to join. His pride was wounded, his authority challenged. But the tide in the room had turned, and he knew it. Marcus stepped down from the podium, his expression unchanged. For him, it wasn't about the applause, it was about the silence that had been broken. Outside, as the crowd dispersed, Darren Jacobs approached him, eyes wide with respect. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly, "for standing up, for all of us." Marcus placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "The fight isn't always out there," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. "Sometimes it's right here. And it's not about one man winning. It's about all of us choosing better." The night was cool, the air heavy with both relief and tension. Crestfield had been shaken, its comfortable silence disrupted. But change, Marcus knew, never came easy. It was fought for, not with fists or fury, but with courage, dignity, and truth. The days following the town hall meeting were unlike anything Crestfield had seen in years. Conversations once whispered behind closed doors now spilled openly into streets, workplaces, and church pews. People debated fiercely, some defending Marcus's call for dignity, others stubbornly clinging to Turner's side. But something undeniable had shifted. Silence had been broken, and Crestfield could no longer pretend ignorance. For Marcus, life went on much as before. He rose before dawn, trained alongside his soldiers, reviewed reports, and carried the responsibility of command with the same unwavering discipline. Yet, in quiet moments, he reflected on what had unfolded. He had not asked to become the center of the town's reckoning, but the incident had forced truth into the light. His role now was not to savor victory, but to guide what came next. Turner, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. Where once his badge had granted him unchecked authority, now it drew suspicion. Store clerks no longer greeted him with warmth. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked by. Even some of his fellow officers avoided him, unwilling to be associated with the shame his actions had brought. Turner, in his pride, called them cowards. Yet deep down he felt the ground slipping from beneath him. The mayor, sensing the growing unrest, sought a private meeting with Marcus. He arrived at the base with carefully chosen words, emphasizing unity, progress, and the town's respect for the military. But Marcus saw through the polished phrases. "Respect isn't spoken, Mayor," Marcus said calmly. "It's lived. If Crestfield wants to heal, it can't just put a Band-Aid over what happened. This town needs to face itself. That means accountability, not speeches." The mayor shifted uncomfortably but nodded. He knew Marcus was right. He also knew the base commander's influence was too great to dismiss. Meanwhile, Darren Jacobs had become something of a symbol among the younger townsfolk. He spoke with passion about what he had witnessed, about the importance of standing up even when it was hard. At first, his voice trembled when he addressed groups at the community center or after church, but each time, he grew steadier, fueled by Marcus's example. "If a man like Colonel Hill can endure that kind of hate with dignity," Darren told a crowd, "then the least we can do is speak the truth." As the weeks passed, Crestfield found itself at a crossroads. Petitions circulated demanding Turner's resignation. Local businesses quietly reached out to Marcus, offering apologies for the town's failure to defend him. Churches began holding discussions about racial justice, led by pastors who admitted they had remained silent for too long. It was not transformation overnight, but the cracks in old walls of prejudice were visible. Turner, bitter and defensive, resisted every step of the way. "They're turning this town upside down for one man," he grumbled to anyone who would listen. "I was just doing my job." But fewer and fewer stood beside him. Even those who once laughed at his remarks now avoided his company. Isolation was a punishment harsher than any reprimand, and it gnawed at him daily. One evening, as dusk fell over Crestfield, Marcus received a visitor at his office. It was Turner. His uniform looked disheveled, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "I didn't come here for apologies," Turner said bluntly, his voice rough. Marcus looked at him calmly. "Then why are you here?" Turner hesitated, the weight of his pride pressing hard. "Because this whole town's looking at me like I'm the devil. And you—" He paused, bitterness cutting his words. "You could destroy me if you wanted, but you haven't. Why?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Because destruction isn't justice, Officer Turner. What you did was wrong, and you must answer for it. But tearing you down won't heal Crestfield. Accountability and change will." Turner shifted uneasily. For the first time, his bravado faltered. He wasn't ready to confess, but a seed had been planted. Marcus saw it. Not a change of heart, not yet, but the faint crack where light might one day seep through. The real turning point came weeks later. The town organized a community event at the base, something that had been planned months earlier but now carried a deeper significance. Families poured onto the grounds, mingling with soldiers, sharing food, laughter, and stories. Children climbed on military vehicles, eyes wide with awe. At the center of it all stood Marcus, not as the man humiliated in a diner, but as the leader he truly was. He spoke to the crowd, his words woven with humility and strength. "This base doesn't just protect walls and borders," he said. "It protects people, every person, no matter their skin, their background, or their station. That's what we fight for. That's what we stand for. And that's what Crestfield must stand for too, if it wishes to thrive." His words resonated beyond applause. They sank into the hearts of many who had never before confronted their own silence. In the crowd, Darren's mother wept quietly, clutching her younger son's hand. An older white couple, once dismissive of outsiders, nodded solemnly. Even Turner, standing at the edge of the gathering, shifted uncomfortably, unable to dismiss the truth radiating from Marcus's presence. By the end of the evening, the sense of division that had gripped Crestfield felt less suffocating. Not gone, not healed entirely, but softened by the possibility of something better. In the months that followed, real changes began. The police department introduced new training, not because the mayor demanded it, but because townsfolk insisted on it. Community leaders, black and white, began working together on initiatives for youth, determined to give the next generation more hope than hate. Turner was eventually removed from his post after continued resistance to accountability, a decision met with relief by many. As for Marcus, he never boasted about his role in Crestfield's awakening. He carried on with his duties, guiding his soldiers, preparing them for challenges abroad, while quietly helping his community grow at home. To him, dignity was not in titles or applause. It was in living the principles he had fought for, even when the battlefield was a diner, a town hall, or a divided community. One evening, months after the incident, Marcus found himself once again sitting in Mary's diner. The same window seat, the same quiet view of Main Street. This time, the waitress greeted him warmly, her smile genuine, her voice steady. Patrons nodded respectfully, some even stopping to shake his hand. As he sipped his coffee, Darren walked in, now more confident than ever, carrying a notebook under his arm. He spotted Marcus and approached, his face bright. "Colonel," Darren said, "I'm thinking of applying to the academy. I want to serve, like you." Marcus studied him for a moment, pride glimmering in his eyes. "Then serve with dignity, Darren, not just in uniform but in life. The fight for justice doesn't end when the war is over. It lives in every choice we make." The young man nodded, his resolve firm. Outside, the town of Crestfield carried on, still imperfect, still wrestling with its truths, but undeniably changed. The memory of what had happened in that diner lingered, not as shame, but as a turning point. A moment when one man's dignity forced an entire community to confront itself. And in that quiet diner, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the town in gold once again, Marcus Hill knew that battles were not always won with weapons. Sometimes, the greatest victories came from standing tall, refusing to bow to hate, and reminding the world, one town at a time, what true courage looked like.